Hello, I'm Sally Hogg, and this is the Mobilise podcast from the Centre for Research on Play in Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge. Mobilise is a mini-series in which I talk to leading policymakers and politicians from across the UK about how research can be used in policy to improve children's lives. We'll be finding out about the things our guests have achieved for children and about the challenges that arise when trying to use research-based evidence in complex political environments. If you've got any interest in research, child development and children's policy, then this is a podcast for you. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir David Bell. In a career spanning over 40 years, David has held a number of major posts across the education system, including the most senior policy position in the UK as Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education. David held this role for 6 years from 2006, serving 4 Secretaries of State and 3 Prime Ministers. Before joining government, David was a primary school teacher, a head teacher, a local authority director of education, and Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools at Ofsted, so he really has seen the education system from many perspectives. David's now Vice-Chancellor at the University of Sunderland. He's recently focused his attention back to the early stages of the education system, undertaking a review of early years provision for the Labour Party. We're delighted that David's an advisor to the Mobilise programme that we're currently running, to help civil servants use the science of early childhood development in their work. Welcome, David. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Sally. Great to speak to you too.
So let's start today by just reflecting back on your career. So thinking back to your time working in the Department of Education, or the Department of Children as it became, what are you proudest of?
I think when you speak as a civil servant, in a sense, you're speaking about pride in the achievements of the government of the day and the extent to which the civil service has helped to achieve those objectives. So maybe 2 examples. First of all, during the Labour government period, and when the Department for Children's Schools and Families was created, we published something called the Children's Plan. And it was really the first time, I think, across government we had sought to integrate all aspects of children's policy. Yes, of course, education, but aspects to do with justice, to do with health, to do with well-being and the like. And that was a major policy achievement that took quite a bit of work to make happen. So that was really, really interesting to do. Then a very different kind of policy area, when the coalition government came into power in 2010, we moved very rapidly to achieve the passing of the Academies Act. In fact, we did that between May and July, one of the fastest pieces of legislation on record. And that led to the expansion of the Academies programme from 2010 onwards.
Thinking back to the legacy of those things, the Children's Plan brought, as you say, all of those different bits of children's policy together and really focused on the child and that Every Child Matters agenda. Do you still think that has left a legacy in terms of the joined up thinking, or perhaps do we need to revisit some of that again?
I think it did leave a legacy because many professionals today still talk about Every Child Matters. I think in substantive terms, it also encouraged, and I think has continued to encourage, people to try to make the connections between children's policy. So, for example, when we're thinking of children's early well-being and welfare, we're not just thinking about educational outcomes, we're thinking about their social development, their health development, how they interact and engage with others, how services can support children to thrive and to support families to help the children to thrive. So I think that has been a long-lasting legacy. In relation to the Academies Act, of course, the academies now are a very well-established part of the English education system. And because of that change, I suspect that we're not going to see any great substantial policy shift should there be a change of government. But I'm sure what we will see is a refining of that policy. I think Labour may be more interested again in the connections between different aspects of children's policy. And therefore, I think there's a legacy from a number of years ago that can be built upon to achieve future success.
It feels intuitively obvious that we should be thinking about children in that collective, holistic way, because obviously that's how children's lives work. What Why was it? What were some of the challenges in getting government to think in that way?
Government is notoriously siloed, and indeed, trying to get people across government to work together effectively is more difficult than you think it should be. It's very rarely because people are malign or ill intentioned, just the way government works and the focus on a departmental structure means working across those structures can be tricky. But I think if you've got strong political leadership and you've got a determination to make things happen, then they can. So, for example, when the Children's Act was being put together, the Department for Children's Schools and Families was led by Ed Balls, a very big politician, a big thinker, very close to the Prime Minister, very determined to get things happen, to get things to happen. So I think if you have that sort of leadership, you can make change, but it's not straightforward. And of course, the other advantage that Ed Balls had was that he was Secretary of State for 3 years. Now, that in one sense is a very short period of time, but in ministerial terms, it's almost an eternity. So, actually, in 3 years, he was able to achieve a lot and actually drove a lot of cross government activity very effectively during that time.
Political leadership is obviously one of those ingredients of making those things happen. What did you find as a civil servant really helped to bring the policymakers together at that level?
I think we were very clear at that point that policy was great, but actually it had to be implemented. And there was a lot of focus, particularly during the Labour years, on what became known as, in horrible jargon, delivery chains. In very simple terms, that was to think about how you translated policy, obviously formed at the central government level, all the way through and down the system. So that the person who was working in a school or in a Sure Start centre or a playgroup got a sense of what we were trying to do. So I think during that era, we were thinking very carefully about how you translated policy into practice. But I think it also worked the other way, Sally. We were very keen to seek the views as policy was being formed from those who were out in the system making it happen day by day. And I think it was one of the singular achievements of that period that we drew together a very large informal coalition of the willing, people who wanted to make things happen, very much understood and I think bought the vision of the children's plan. And I'm sure that was one of the reasons we were more successful in implementing that policy than perhaps other policies.
A real virtuous cycle there where you're doing things that feel right to people. So obviously, we're here in the University of Cambridge and we're interested in how research evidence informs and is part of that puzzle alongside insights from families and insights from practice to support policy making. Thinking back to your time in government, can you think of a particular piece of research evidence that really informed policy?
I think just before I turn to an example or two there, Sally, there's an interesting reflection on the extent to which policy does and can influence political decision making. And sometimes researchers and others in the universities world can be frustrated as they don't think that politicians pay enough attention to research. I think sometimes there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding about the different rhythms. So the political rhythm inevitably is driven by electoral cycles and, of course, the pace of decision making and the need to get things done quickly. And that's an entirely legitimate way of thinking of the world in a democracy. The research focus inevitably is different because you want to ensure that research is done to a particular standard. It will often be done over time. It will be thoroughly peer reviewed and the like. And inevitably, therefore, those are not approaches that necessarily dovetail. So the secret, I think, is first of all for researchers and those who are doing research to understand those political rhythms. But it's also, I think, for the politicians and the policymakers in government to try to find ways in which you can access the best sort of research. And I think it's important to stress, and sometimes people can be a bit cynical about this, that in the main, my experience of politicians was they were very interested in research. Now, we're talking about an area of social policy here, Sally. So sometimes people will have different interpretations of the research. Sometimes the research is not categorical one way or the other. And of course, politics is driven by values as well. So you've got this really interesting mix of these different things coming together. So, to take two or three examples that I can think of, there was a big policy push in the Labour era to raise the participation age. I guess we might call that in more colloquial days, raise the school leaving age from 16 to 18. And there was a lot of research done in advance of that to look at systems elsewhere where participation age was higher, to do some trials, proper trials of that participation age, and then afterwards to do some early evaluation. And indeed, I know that there's going to be another piece of evaluation work done on that policy very soon. So there was a genuine attempt there to provide deep research that could inform the policy decisions that ministers made. I should also say during that era, the Labour government set up a number of research centres. So effectively, these were commissioned through universities and other organisations that had a research focus. And the agreement there was that both longer term research could be used to inform policy, but also you could get rather rapid research insights. So if policymakers were developing a policy for ministers, you could go to the research centres and say, what literature exists already in this field? And what can you share with us about research insights? So that was, I think, a very effective way of utilising research, both as it were deep research as well as summaries of research. Another example, in the coalition era, there was a big push on qualifications reform. And one thing that Michael Gove, who was then the Secretary of State, was very interested in was to find out what the best and highest performing education systems in the world were doing when it came to assessment and qualifications. And Michael used to say, I'm not particularly interested in what happened with A levels in the 1950s or the 1960s, despite many people being talking about a golden era. And so he said that's in one sense completely irrelevant. What we need to understand is what's happening elsewhere. And we did a lot of research there about qualifications reform across the world. We did evaluations of the best qualifications and assessment methods. And I think that did inform policy. Now, in the examples that I've given, Sally, they were not uncontested. Not everyone supported the raising of the participation age. Not everyone supported qualifications reform. But actually, I think both Ed Balls and Michael Gove could say we had good, solid research underpinning our decisions. But of course, in the end, we make political choices.
Yes, and of course, it's always that balance between those different things. Can you think back to particular insights that you got from the research in those instances that perhaps surprised you or added a depth or new information that didn't come from other sources?
I think if you looked at the participation age, we were able to utilize the research to understand better what other systems had done, both what they had done successfully and some of the pitfalls in research. So, for example, we found that raising the participation age in itself may be a good thing, but there were also necessary preconditions, particularly in relation to students who might otherwise have thought they were going to be leaving school at 16. So you had to think, and we got some very good insights about the training and development of staff that were going to be involved in this move, particularly in further education colleges. So we actually derived really interesting insights there. I think on the qualifications reform, it was quite easy to indulge in what you might call educational tourism. So, a minister goes off to a different country and says, oh, I've seen them do this, that, and the other. We must implement it here. I think we were able to understand cultural insights through research. So, for example, when people looked at South Korea, which was often being talked about as a model of assessment reform, actually, you had to understand the educational system in that country. You had to understand the sort of cultural drivers in that system. You actually had to understand, and we got some really good insight here about a very, very high stakes, high pressure testing environment. And I think in the policy making there, we were trying to balance the rigor of a new approach to qualifications with a sensitivity to the cultural context in England, which of course was very different to South Korea. And I think it also taught us that educational tourism can be quite dangerous if you don't underpin it with proper research insights and a real depth of thinking about your context compared to a context in a different jurisdiction.
That resonates a lot, particularly in the early childhood space, where we're very keen to draw on models where actually the funding system and the whole cultural appetite towards childcare and early education is very different. So we need to understand that. Um, so you've talked about some examples there where the research supported what the politicians wanted to do and their values. There may obviously be also situations where perhaps research evidence suggests that what political forces are driving for perhaps isn't the best thing for children or children's outcomes. And can you talk a little bit about your role as a civil servant in helping politicians to navigate those situations where perhaps the research suggests that the path that they're treading maybe isn't the best one to go down?
I think it goes back to my point, Sally, about operating in an area of social policy where the evidence can often be contested. And therefore, to some extent, it ultimately relies on political choice. And I think maybe a very good example of that is early reading and the role of phonics and the point at which phonics-based education, a phonics-based approach to reading, rather, should be introduced. There was quite a lot of evidence emerging, certainly really from the late 90s through the early part of the Labour government, that we needed to rethink the way we were teaching reading. And of course, we got developments like the literacy hour and the numeracy hour coming then. Of course, as the years went on, and certainly when the Conservatives came to power, or the coalition came to power, there was a very strong push to solidify and codify even more on a phonics-based approach. And actually, to be honest, I think the research was ambiguous on some of that. And actually, in the end, there was a proper role for the politicians to say, no, actually, we believe it should be this rather than that. And I know there were some people in the research and reading community who thought it was an abomination what was done, but actually, it was a choice that was not, as it were, research free or evidence free. It was a choice to be made that actually a greater emphasis on phonics at an earlier stage would be more beneficial. Now, here we are 10, almost 14 years on from the beginnings of that push after the coalition government came in, and it's still contested. So, of course, the current administration are saying you can point to international league tables now and say that that policy has been a great success, but not everyone accepts that. Some people say yes, but of course that's overinflating the importance of the international league tables. It fails to take account of different contextual factors. It doesn't reflect the experience of all children in all circumstances. So, you can have the best research if you looked at it in a sort of through the eyes of the research community, but in the end, there will still be choices to be made. But I can hardly think, actually, Sally, of any example where, as it were, a policy just came out of the air and there was absolutely no backing for it by anything that would constitute reasonable evidence or research. And I think that's where civil servants were really useful and helpful to ministers, because they would often lay that out in summary terms. This is what we know. Here are the choices you have. Ultimately, minister, it's up to you to decide.
You reflected in some of the things you said about some of the difficulties about research informing policy, the different timescales, the contestability of research. Um, can you tell us a bit about how you think that the relationship between researchers and policymakers and politicians can work well, and what can facilitate that?
I think it generally does actually, Sally, work well. So, for example, I just noticed in the last month or so, the Department for Education has published its research priorities list. So, there it takes a number of themes and then it divides those up into sub themes and says that the department is interested in the following areas and we're inviting people to contribute. So, there's a sort of constant demand for that evidence and research. And of course, each department in government has somebody who's there effectively as the chief scientific officer, and that is the person who takes the oversight within a government department for, amongst other things, research activity. So in a sense, there's a well-established route in for researchers to contribute their thinking. And I think it's quite important that researchers, if they're interested in influencing policy, do take account of those research suggestions and proposals, because it can be, and I heard some frustration from ministers in my time in government, there can be a sense that, well, the research community, particularly in education research, is doing all of this interesting stuff over there, but it doesn't speak to the things that we are very interested in tackling at the national level, either because they need to be tackled and or we believe we have a political mandate to tackle them. Now, that is not to say that the only kind of research that should be done is that that's driven by government. But if you want to influence policy and you want to influence government thinking, then I think you have to be smart enough to realize that there will be research priorities that you might be able to contribute to. I think the other thing, and I often sat in conversations where researchers would present to ministers, they weren't always very good at it, bluntly. They didn't understand that sort of political rhythm. Or, and in some ways even worse, they became rather snooty about it. Oh, well, these politicians, it's here today, gone tomorrow. They just want something to back their position. And actually, I think that was a gross caricature of how ministers thought. But what ministers wanted was evidence that was digestible and understandable, and that they could at least consider when they were thinking about policy. So I still think there's a way to go, Sally, in helping the research community understand and influence government. And there's been quite a lot of effort on that front, but certainly more to do. And maybe with a new government, potentially in the aftermath of the election, there will be new priorities. And so the research community, if it wants to influence, has to be ready to provide work to help the new government, if there is to be one, make new policy decisions.
I mean, my role as a policy fellow is quite a unique one, sitting in an academic institution but with a policy background and doing that translation work. You know, being a translator and building the understanding of academics about how to communicate, and really moving us, I think, from a model where we have our evidence and we want to tell government about it, to being that broker, actually appreciating all of the knowledge we have in PEDAL and in the faculty, and thinking, well, what are the problems that policymakers are trying to solve, and how can we broker the evidence to help them with that, rather than starting with what we know and what we found out. But it is a big shift.
It is a big shift, and you know, there was a period of time. Certainly, when I went to Ofsted in 2002, my predecessor, but one, was the late Chris Woodhead, who was a very controversial chief inspector. And one of the reasons why he was so controversial was, I mean, he just dismissed with a wave of a hand anything that was called educational research. I mean, just dismissed it, said it was all nonsense, it was all rubbish, it was irrelevant, etc. And I think it did have a ripple effect. And I think quite a lot of educational researchers at that time lost confidence in research. Now, actually, there was a shift and a change, because when Labour came in 1997, one of the key policy advisors was Sir Michael Barber, who became the senior policy advisor to David Blunkett and had a very important role. And Michael was an academic, and he was able, I think, to give confidence back to the system that they wanted to hear what good research was telling us about the problems that needed to be addressed and solved. Um, and although some people might have their own views about the last 10 or 15 years, again, I have had no suggestion from, now that I'm an outsider, from the inside, that there's a cavalier or there's a uninterested approach to research. Um, I think there is still that interest in research, but we're into a period of potential change. And again, people are going to have to adjust how they think. And as you suggested, address the problems that really matter to politicians, and particularly a new government, should there be one.
So before we go, David, I want to talk to you a bit about your role in thinking about the potential change in administration. I know you've been doing some work with the Labour Party about early years provision. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, Bridget Phillipson is the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, coincidentally, a Sunderland Member of Parliament, so somebody that I'd got to know well previously. And Bridget asked me if I was happy to undertake this review of early years. And there's a number of characteristics to the review. We want to look at quality and a longer term approach to the early years and childcare workforce. We want to look at the potential for expansion of the childcare provision, early education childcare provision. And we're also interested just more generally on what the future shape and organisation of the early years and childcare system should be. Now, of course, this has been quite a hot and topical political issue because the Chancellor of the Exchequer last budget made a big commitment to expand childcare provision both in 2024 and 25. Now, there's a whole set of issues about whether that's going to be a success in its implementation. So I'm probably less concerned about the immediate short term, although I do think an incoming Secretary of State may have a bit of a problem to deal with if the current government's policy runs into the rocks. And there is some evidence that it might be doing so. But what I've been trying to do is to think a bit more longer term. So, what will it take to change the way in which we do early education in child? What does that mean for example, the training of staff? What does it mean for the structure of the system? And going back to what you were saying earlier about research evidence, I mean, I've been very interested to look at comparative systems. So, there's been quite interesting developments in Ireland. There's been quite interesting developments in Australia. And again, got to be culturally aware, but I'm trying to draw upon that. One thing that's really, really good, Sally, about doing this work, amongst many things, is that there's such a rich evidence base to draw upon. I mean, really tremendous. And actually, I think that's a good example of where an area that was rather under researched, say 20 years ago, has now become a richly researched area. And of course, your own work is an example of that. And there's a lot of good evidence out there. So I'm not trying to, as it were, go back and do, as it were, basic evidence gathering, because there's a lot of that out there. What I'm trying to do is to think about how that might influence the shape of policy in the future. Now, again, to repeat a point I've made already, some of it is contested. So, for example, the benefits of early education and childcare for children at different ages before they go to primary school. There's quite a bit of evidence there, but quite a bit of discussion about what are the characteristics of high quality. There's quite a lot of evidence about whether you should have a targeted approach, say, to more disadvantaged children, or whether it should be a universal approach. These are all good areas of discussion, and actually, there's research that would support one or a number of different policy positions. But I think this is an area that is now well researched and well evidenced, and that has made my job so much more straightforward to be able to draw on the excellent work that policy researchers have been doing to influence policymakers in recent years.
Thank you. That's good to hear. And I guess listening to you talk there about that research and the contestability, it's a little bit like the story you're telling earlier about phonics, that actually, as researchers and policymakers, often we have to think about, well, what works for most children, what seems to work. But under that, children's lives are very complex and there are a lot of different things. And for individual children, the solutions and the right answers might be quite different to what the research shows as a population.
Yes, and actually, I think that's particularly acute when it comes to children with special educational needs and disabilities. I think that is an area of work where I think most policymakers and probably quite a lot of politicians would accept we haven't done as well as we should, particularly for families and children in those earliest of years. Now, it's really complicated and it's expensive and there's not always the expertise there. So that's a really good example of where you have to have a general approach, and that will be for ministers to decide what the general approach is. But within that, you can look at specific target groups. Another example would be disadvantage, because we know that high quality, I think one thing that people, virtually everyone would agree on, is that for the youngest children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, if they get high quality early education and childcare, that can make a substantial difference. So you can have a universal approach, but you can also want to ensure that you're targeting those populations that really do need more specific attention.
We've got time for one final question, David. So I just want to think, what do you think are the big questions about child development that we don't yet have good enough answers for and you'd like to see researchers focus attention on?
Wow, that's a great last question, Sally. And I think there's a couple of things that I would just want to think about. I think there is an interesting question coming back to this point about younger children and the time that they spend in early education and childcare settings. So there's one school of thought that says we can point to very substantial evidence about the benefits for disadvantaged children. There's other people who would say that's right, but the evidence is more mixed when it comes to the population as a whole. I think that's worthy of further examination. I think the other area, and of course, this is really interesting at the moment, is the question of long term benefits of early education. I mean, I've had a number of people who've said to me, "Oh, are we bringing back Sure Start centres and we're bringing back that whole initiative of the Labour era?" And certainly Bridget Phillipson's focus is not on the structures, but there is a whole set of, I think, interesting questions about longer term outcomes. And now we're almost, 20 years on from that policy first being implemented. So I think it will be interesting to look at the longer term benefits. And do we know anything about what configuration of services and support in early years settings like Sure Start centres that tended to be more successful for positive outcomes for children, and those that maybe had neutral or no effect on children? So that's the second area. And then I suppose there's still that whole question of brain development, Sally, and the extent to which we understand. We understand much more about that. Do we quite yet understand how that is going to influence the sorts of approaches that we take to early years education and childcare? And I think that's a really, really fruitful area to look at. And then maybe one last final point, just to pick up something else. I think there is still value in researchers looking at comparative systems, not just in Ireland and Australia we've mentioned, but what else is going on around the world that could inform what we are doing here in the UK. This is a big opportunity. I mean, Bridget Phillipson, just even again recently in a television interview with Laura Kunsberg of the BBC, talked about early education and childcare being her top priority when if she does become Secretary of State for Education. Now, there's a great opportunity for the Peddle Centre, a great opportunity for researchers in early education and childcare to influence the shape of policy potentially for 5, 10 years, and who knows, even longer.
Thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation, David. I really appreciate your time, and great to end on those messages of optimism and excitement for those of us in the early years sector. Before we go, I'd just like to remind our listeners that if you enjoyed listening to this conversation with David, please do check out the other podcasts in our series, which you can find on whichever platform you get your podcasts. And please tell your colleagues about the Mobilise podcast too. Mobilise is a mini-series created by the Centre for Research on Play in Education and Development and Learning here at the University of Cambridge. For more information about PEDAL and to access our wider resources, please visit our website pedalhub.net. Thank you for listening.